Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple of my European nightcrawler worm bins. And up until now, those bins have been situated in lower levels, and at the present time they're now up on the top shelf finally. Graduated to the senior level, and technically they're my oldest active systems right now. They're the ones that are stacked up one on top of the other. Up until now they were down on the lower shelf, and as you can see there's a pipe over here. And it made it a little bit of a tight squeeze, but I was able to get them stacked one on top of the other. A lot of times I'll stack bins in such a way that I put little spacers like these paint stirring sticks that you get from the hardware store when you buy paint, but here I didn't have room for those spacers, and I just kind of stacked them one on top of the other, and they're fitting in here. These other bins, the only reason these are still here is because I'm just trying to bait straggler worms out, but technically these are just the castings that have been already harvested from completed systems. So that's what makes these bins that we're checking in on today my oldest active systems with the European nightcrawler. So I'm going to get them up on the shelf now that we've verified that their position on the top shelf is going to work out this way, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. Before we dive in and get my hands all dirty, just figured I'd share some info about these bins with you. Their age at this point in time is 276 days that these bins have been in service. And there have been 24 feedings up until now, the last of which was 12 days ago. And what they got last time is the same stuff that they're going to get today, which is my worm chow combined with some coffee. I think even the name of the video last time alluded to the fact that the feeding had been made up of small particle-sized foods. When we came in last time, 12 days ago, we were still seeing some leftovers of the feeding that came before, which was cantaloupe melon. A lot of times you would expect to put melon into a worm bin and not find a whole lot of leftovers, but we still saw some leftovers from the previous feeding. But now, 12 days later, it seems unlikely that we would see any. One thing we're definitely seeing for sure over here, though, is a tremendous amount of springtail activity. I mean, these things are in this system in great numbers. Perhaps not so much over here, but over here in bin number 2, yeah. Lots of springtails. Look at them all. I don't know, something about the springtails. I just kind of, in a way, wish I didn't have quite so many. I do read everyone's feedback that I get in the comments, and a lot of people question why I balk at the presence of the springtails here in my systems. I don't know. It just seems like perhaps there's more in here than need to be. These coffee filters, including the one that we were just looking at a moment ago, these indicate to me where we last fed. So these are my so-called feeding zone indicators, and we did sort of centralize the coffee and the worm chow we gave them last time in the middle. So it kind of made sense to put down a feeding zone indicator, but this time I was thinking about applying the food a little bit differently. And the whole idea there was to get the food that I'm giving them today blended in everywhere. So I thought that rather than checking out the bin and looking around, I thought maybe we would begin by sprinkling the portion out across the top, and then just in the process of, examining and inspecting how things are doing, the material would all just kind of get blended in as a matter of course. So I'm going to give that a try here, and I guess just by the nature of doing it that way, we're not really going to have a feeding zone. That's going to require a marker. And the feeding zone indicator that we pulled out of here in bin number 1 was pretty far gone, you got to admit. So reusing the feeding zone indicators that were in here would have been a bit difficult. Now, what is that? Did that come out of the coffee, or was that part of what was in the bin? It's just so super tough, it won't break. Perhaps it was something that was in the bin and I guess the question I have is, how did it get into the bin? Could it be that I put some food into the system that I didn't really know what it was? And I don't know. Sometimes I wonder about the things I find in my worm bins, how they get there. I mean, I do chalk up certain unidentified materials to just being stuff that was sucked up by my leaf blower and leaf vacuum when I'm collecting leaves, because a lot of times I do use leaves from my garden as bedding in my system. So who knows, maybe that was just some sort of a stick that got sucked up by my leaf blower and ended up in leaves that we used as bedding, and maybe that explains it. So we're putting in a small particle size feeding today again, like last time. And I guess the other good thing about this feeding is that it's relatively dry material. And you know, I think even during the last check-in we found chunks of corn cob. Here we have the stem of a pepper. So there's definitely residual leftover food items from previous feedings. But I assume that at some point we'll probably end up screening. Here's another pepper stem. We'll probably end up screening this material to try to exclude any sort of large chunk leftovers of food or anything else. So then what we're left with at the end is really a nice fine batch of worm castings. I think we even during the last check-in hinted at the possibility of taking measures to help these systems start drying off a little bit, because we might have noticed how the stuff in these bins is a little bit overly damp. But we did do the routine of just returning the plastic covers so that the system can continue to hang on to its moisture content. And I'm even questioning whether or not I would want to go down that road yet of trying to help the material in these systems start drying off. It does seem to me like as long as there's a fairly good amount of moisture in the system, the worms are just able to be much more productive, not to mention just happy and healthy and lively, because the moisture isn't just kind of comfort for the worms. It's vital to their ability to take in oxygen from the moisture that they come in contact with. So the moisture in the worm bins is not a trivial thing by any means. If the worms are lacking in moisture, not only do they start to get a little bit dehydrated and scrawny and stuff like that, but they're also, to a certain point, probably deprived of oxygen, which is going to make them lethargic and, I would assume, in general, somewhat unhealthy. So it makes me even wonder whether I would want to take the approach that I've been taking in a few of my recently harvested systems, which was to allow the material to really get fairly dry so that it would make for a nice easy screening of the material. This material, despite the fact that it's fairly damp, it does feel like it's crumbling really well, and it might only need a little bit more drying to really get flowing nicely and to eliminate a lot of this clumpiness that I'm still observing. And then it would be nice to be able to possibly screen the material in these bins to separate the worms and large chunk materials to yield a nice batch of finished castings. That's just the way I've been doing some of the harvests of the bins that I've brought to their end recently, using the screening method. But I was thinking about, for these little guys, possibly returning to the migration approach, which would be to just set up a portion of their environment with nice fresh bedding and food and stuff, and letting all this stuff remain uncovered and gradually get a little bit drier, theoretically triggering the movement of the worms out of the stuff due to the diminishing amount of moisture, and then they could easily get rounded up in that section of the container that's designated to be their migration zone. So I'm still debating on how I want to play it, and part of my decision could actually be dictated by the way the material feels as I'm examining it. And if it's nice and crumbly and loose, I do find a certain benefit to doing the screening approach, just because it sort of gets you from active composting to separated castings in a fairly short period of time. You know, I guess the finished product at that point is really the worms being separated from their castings too, so that they can be easily relocated into a new home to continue their work. But the migration approach typically takes a little bit longer, you know. The worms are required to get over into the collection area on their own, and you could try to motivate them to do that with stuff that's going to attract them to a certain point, nice food and nice bedding and moisture over in the collection area. But I guess the other half of that is to also make the stuff that they're inhabiting a little bit less hospitable and comfortable to remain in. That's where the drying of the material, I believe, comes into effect. So I believe we've probably managed to blend in all that worm chow and coffee nice and thoroughly throughout the entire bin in both cases here. I can kind of feel as I encounter a section of material that's not yet been tilled up and aerated, because it's still sort of clumping together, but I think I've already managed to make about 2 loops, 2 laps, 2 loops, 2 rounds through both systems, aerating and moving the materials around so that the food can get all blended in, so that we can kind of dislodge material that's kind of clumping together. And I do believe that we're simply going to go back to covering up with plastic at this point. You know, I am very tempted to simply leave this piece of paper with all the springtails out of the worm bin, and as the piece of paper dries, those little critters are just going to have nowhere to go. They're just going to end up drying right there on the paper. They're not going to have anywhere to go. So I believe I'm going to take that approach with this stuff here. It might seem a little bit cruel and unusual, but you know, I'm not too worried about it. Besides, we don't need a feeding zone indicator at this point. There's food everywhere. We just spread it all over the place. So let's forget about feeding zone indicators anymore, at least based on the way we fed here, because I don't think that they're needed. So a relatively dry feeding, a little bit of aeration, but still sticking to the plastic coverings to allow the systems to hang on to their moisture a little bit longer, to give the worms a little bit more of an opportunity to continue working down the stuff in these bins. And then perhaps at some point in the near future, we'll start taking other active measures to try to get these systems ready for harvest. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please, don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.